Hello there, fighting fans, and welcome to another episode of Build the Roster. And you know, here on Thorgy's Arcade, we're getting real close to that 100,000 subscribers mark. Like, holy cow, we are knocking on its door, and I really want to hit that number before the end of the year. So for today's episode, I need to do something special. I need to do something big. Something really big. Gigantic. Monstrous. Humongous. Oh. I was just gonna do that Virtua Fighter versus Tekken video that everyone keeps asking for, but yeah, you know what? Never mind. This works too. Hello everyone and welcome to Build the Roster, the show where we take a hypothetical fighting game and build our dream roster around it. And ever since I started this show, I had a list of topics that I wanted to tackle, with a Godzilla fighting game being high up there. But why do it now? Shouldn't I wait until a brand new Godzilla movie is coming out to get that brand synergy going? Well, what can I say? Something about 2025 has just really made me pine for a giant lizard to come stomping through town. But also, I'm kinda just getting tired of waiting for a brand new Godzilla fighting game. I mean, Godzilla used to get fighting games all the time, all the way back in the arcades, the Pipeworks trilogy, that PS4 game that I really wish I had bought back when it was cheap and not going for $500. Holy crap, yeah, regretting that one. But now, it's been a while. I mean, his only fighting game appearance this generation has been a guest character in Gigabash. Side note, play Gigabash. That game is insanely fun, huge cosign on that. And when you stop and think about it, if there was ever a time when Godzilla should be in another fighting game, it's now. His star is currently riding high, whether it be the blockbusting MonsterVerse films, the mind-blowing Shin Godzilla, or the award-winning Godzilla -1, this might be the most popular that Godzilla has been in decades. So today, we're doing what we always do when we pine for old fighting games that will never return, and we're going to do it ourselves. Yes, we are going to pretend like a brand new Godzilla fighting game is in the works, and we're going to build that roster. And before I start, just going to give a quick recommendation. I know there might be a lot of people out there who are not big Godzilla fans, they're just tuning in because they like this show. Thank you for doing that. But if you hear me talk about anything today and you think, oh wow, I kinda wanna watch that movie, I kinda wanna get into Godzilla, a ton of the films that I'm going to be referencing today are available for free and totally legally on Tubi or on the Internet Archives. This video isn't sponsored by them or anything. Heck, I don't even think the Internet Archives has ever sponsored anyone. I just figured I'd help out anyone who wants to check these films out without spending a ton of cash. If you are a movie buff, Tubi and the Internet Archives are great resources. So, let's begin by establishing the rules. For the roster size, we're going to go with 18 characters. And the way that I reached that number is, I looked at the starting roster size of every Godzilla fighting game, added them all up, and then realized that is in no way a fair way to gauge an accurate roster size for this game, because like half those Godzilla fighting games were large simply because they reused a metric ton of assets from previous games, and by having multiple characters share a ton of overlaps in their playstyles. So yeah, I just kinda said screw it and went with 18 because that's how many characters were in the launch roster of Street Fighter 6. And out of all the fighting games released in the last generation, yeah, their roster size is pretty much right down the middle. Some rosters have been bigger, some have been smaller, so 18's pretty even. But the next rule is, who counts for this roster? And the answer to that is pretty simple. Any monster who has been in a Godzilla film. And I know some people right now are saying, well, no duh, but you gotta remember, there are like 4 or 5 different eras of Godzilla films, each with their own continuities. Some films have different legal issues around them. So for this roster, I'm just saying, screw it, we're not worrying about different eras, we're not worrying about any legal issues, they're all on the table. But on the other side of that, I know a lot of people, when you discuss a Godzilla fighting game, immediately say, put Gamera in there. Make Gamera a guest character. Gamera and Godzilla need to fight, have it happen in a fighting game. And believe me, I get why everyone wants that. These are arguably the two biggest monsters to come out of Japan. Fans have wanted to see them fight forever. Heck, there have even been a few attempts to make it happen, but none of them panned out. But if I include one guest character, then I'd have to open the door to all guest characters. You let in Gamera, then you have to consider Ultraman, Gorgo, Pacific Rim Jaegers, the Beast of 20,000 Fathoms, Hatsune Miku. I mean, they have fought before and she guest stars in everything, why not? So no guest characters, but outside of that, if you were in some kind of a Godzilla property, then you count. So there you go, we got the rules, we got the roster size, all that's left to do now is hope that this video doesn't get 1,000 different copyright claims. Yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and borrow this from Brandon Tinold. Something tells me I'll be needing it a lot today. And now with all that out of the way, there's nothing left to do but to build that roster.
Let them fight.
Of course, our first monster up is going to be Godzilla themselves. We all knew it would be, there was no question. Except for one question. Which version of Godzilla? Yeah, for anyone who is new to the Big G-Man, Godzilla has had 4 different eras. The Showa era, which was all the older original films, the Heisei era, which was the 80s and 90s, the Millennium era, which was the early 2000s, and now we're in the Reiwa era, which is anything going on in the modern day. So I had to pick which version would be our Godzilla for this game. The Showa era is classic, but it's also pretty silly, and I mean that as a compliment. People love the tone of those older movies. But the Godzilla that we choose for this game needs to kind of be the standard go-to Godzilla. It needs to be one that feels like it represents his entire history. And the Showa era is definitely its own thing. Then as for the Reiwa era, listen, the Reiwa era isn't a continuous Godzilla, it's more of multiple extremely different Godzillas who each get a handful of appearances. So yeah, that doesn't make a lot of sense to just pick one of them at random and say, well, that's our Godzilla. So it came down to Heisei or Millennium, and in the end, I went with Heisei. Why? Well, because A, the Heisei films follow a continuity from one film to another, meaning their Godzilla is a bit more established, while the Millennium films are kind of like the Reiwa era. There's some continuity, but they're still largely all over the place and a bit disconnected. But it's mostly because out of all the Godzillas, this is the only one who can ball. Okay, sorry, I just really wanted to find a way to shove that into the video today. No, I'm actually including the Heisei Godzillas because, and I will fully admit, there is probably a boatload of personal bias in this statement because this is the Godzilla that I grew up with, but this Godzilla just feels more like the standard Godzilla. He's big and intimidating looking, like the later Godzillas, but he still has a bit of that actor in the rubber suit charm that the earlier films had. To me, this Godzilla feels like it strikes a good balance between all the different interpretations of this character. And speaking of balance, that's how he'd fight. Heisei Godzilla is going to be our all-rounder character. Average speed, average strength, got the atomic breath for some good range. He's pretty solid all around without being too overpowered in any one category. Now I know some of you are going to have some questions right now, like, why pick the Heisei Godzilla when you can include multiple Godzillas? Good point! I mean, almost every other Godzilla fighting game has always included different versions of our favorite big lizard. So you know what? Yeah, let's do it. There's so many different Godzillas out there that vary so greatly, it would be a crime to only include one. So next up is... Godzilla Monsterverse. I have no idea how this decision is going to be met because I know plenty of Godzilla fans do like the Monsterverse films, but I'm also sure some will say it's sacrilegious to include him over the classic Godzillas. But honestly, I think if you're making a modern-day Godzilla fighting game, this is the #1 version of Godzilla you have to include. First off, it's always important to include the new hotness in your fighting game, and yeah, the MonsterVerse films are kind of a big deal. I know Godzilla -1 also came out not that long ago, and it's also been a huge success, but Godzilla -1 was this really heartbreaking story about the horrors of war and struggling to keep living in the face of such nightmares. It kind of feels disrespectful to me to include that Godzilla in our silly fighting game. MonsterVerse Godzilla, on the other hand, feels like he was made for a fighting game. This guy has one job, and it's to beat the crap out of other kaijus. No, seriously, in the MonsterVerse, they say that Godzilla's role in nature is literally to be the guy who keeps the other kaijus in check. Or titans, whatever, you know what I mean. And because of that, this is the most on-site Godzilla ever. He sees another kaiju, his only thought is, I must destroy it. He's basically the Vegeta of kaijus. He's constantly pissed off, wants to fight everyone, has an ultra ego power-up, and the only thing that calms him down is his hot wife. And as for how he'd fight, this is the Unga Bunga version of Godzilla. He rushes in and starts attacking, and he doesn't stop attacking. Sure, this means that he would have lower defensive options, but MonsterVerse Godzilla doesn't really feel like someone who cares about blocking. But if you do care about that, then for one of his supers, we could give him that power-up that he got in New Empire, and it would temporarily give him armor on all of his attacks, thereby taking care of his one big weakness for a limited amount of time. Essentially, you want to build this Godzilla in a way where when he starts running at you, yeah, you're going to start panicking. And for anybody out there who still has a problem with this version of Godzilla being in this fighting game, this is what his level 3 super would be. I stand by my decision to include him, and I will be taking no further questions. Mothra. Time to move away from Godzilla onto our other kaiju friends, and if you're making a Godzilla game, you have to include Mothra. She is easily one of the most recognizable kaijus ever, and one of the only ones on this list to receive multiple films where she's the hero. I will acknowledge that yes, thinking about how she would work in a fighting game is a bit odd, simply because how exactly are low attacks supposed to hit a character who is constantly flying? But honestly, who cares? It's Mothra. We'll find some way to make it work. It's not like the other Godzilla games had a problem with it. As for how she would fight, I'm picturing Mothra would be our first zoner. She'd have tons of attacks that focus around projectiles, such as flapping her wings to send out gusts of air, she can fire energy from her antennas, she's got electrical attacks, you know, like a moth. But most importantly, thanks to her flight, she would have some pretty high maneuverability. Something a lot of other characters in this game would have some trouble with, considering they're, you know, giant lizards. Meaning she'd be able to keep away from her opponent and keep spamming them with energy blasts from afar. Oh, it's a good thing you're so lovable, Mothra, because in this game your opponents are going to hate you.
The monster again, Zero.
What is Monster Zero?
The demon of our galaxy.
King Ghidorah. This is another no-brainer. If there is any kaiju out there who is considered Godzilla's rival, their arch enemy, it's King Ghidorah. He's one of the biggest villains of the Godzilla universe, except for that time that Godzilla was a ghost resurrected by the souls of everyone killed in World War II, and Ghidorah was a guardian spirit trying to stop him. The Millennium Godzilla films got kinda weird. Now the question here is, how would they play? They're one of the strongest kaiju, so obviously their power would be high, but I can picture their weakness being pretty big hurt boxes, making them an easy target. I mean, they got giant wings, 3 heads, there's a lot that you can hit here. By the way, just going to say this right now, it is very weird discussing giant monsters like they're traditional fighting game characters. Like, Ghidorah has 3 heads. So, how do they throw a punch? With their face? with their wings? This is brand new territory for this show. Well, speaking of those heads, let's give him 3 different energy attacks. 1 from each head, and each one fires at a different height. 1 head fires low, 1 head fires high, and 1 fires upwards for an anti-air. And of course you could give him a big super where all 3 heads fire out at once. Also just throwing this out there, but saying Ghidorah would have multiple projectiles that can fire at different heights, for some reason all I can think of is that makes him the Sagat of kaijus. And you know something? Yeah, that feels right.
I'm going to show you the greatest thing your eyes have ever beheld. He was a king and a god in the world he knew. Ladies and gentlemen, look at Kong, the 8th wonder of the world.
King Kong. Both the Pipeworks fighting games and the PS4 Godzilla game tried to get King Kong into their roster and they couldn't. So I would be willing to say putting King Kong into the roster of a brand new fighting game is a top priority. Not to mention, some of the most popular Godzilla films over the past century have been the ones that center entirely around Godzilla and King Kong fighting. And that's not even a new development. You know what Godzilla's 3rd film was? King Kong vs. Godzilla. You know what the highest grossing film of the Showa era was? King Kong vs. Godzilla. Yeah, from day one, Godzilla and King Kong Studios were like, oh, we have to get these two to fight. And thanks to the fact that these studios are once again pumping out movies together, yeah, there should be no problem making this happen. But in the off chance that there is a problem making that happen, guess what? The movie version of King Kong goes into the public domain in just a few years, and the book version of King Kong is already in the public domain. Which means I can only assume there's gonna be some really crappy cash-in horror films about him any day now. Seriously, can we stop this trend? It is so stupid. My point is, King Kong, next Godzilla fighting game, make it happen. And as for how he'd fight, part of me wants him to have that axe like he had in Godzilla vs. Kong, but let's be real. This roster needs a grappler, and King Kong kind of has to be it. First off, this dude loves to grab opponents and toss them around. It doesn't matter which King Kong film you're watching, he is going to pick an opponent up and put them back down. And secondly, if you're going to put a grappler in your game, it should probably be the one with thumbs. You know, for grabbing. Evolution gave those to him for a reason, he's going to use them. Anguirus. I mentioned that Kong was in Godzilla's 3rd movie, but do you know who was in his 2nd film? That would be everyone's favorite spiky-shelled dinosaur, Anguirus. Yeah, this behemoth of an ankylosaurus was Godzilla's first opponent. And after that, he continued to stick around for multiple films and even kind of became like Godzilla's partner. Yeah, back during the Showa era, Godzilla and Anguirus teamed up all the time. Angie was kind of like G-Man's Robin. Heck, I think he's the only kaiju Godzilla has ever had a conversation with. But how would they fight? Anguirus has a giant shell covered in spikes. Do I even need to say they're the tank of the game? Make him fairly slow, but he would have tons of specials with armor on them. Give him a counter where if you hit him, then the spikes just jut out of his shell, hitting the opponent back. And if you're worried about his mobility, we could give him a rolling attack where he just curls up into a spiked ball and charges at the opponent. Anguirus hasn't been a leading monster in a while, but with defenses like this, players would definitely put some respect on his name. Biollante. Godzilla vs. Biollante wasn't the most successful film in the Heisei era when it was released, but over time its fame has grown. And now it's topping popularity charts, and I'd even be willing to say that Biollante is one of Godzilla's most underrated enemies. This giant plant mutant that was mixed with Godzilla's DNA and then inhabited by the soul of a scientist's daughter. You know what, I take it back, it wasn't just the Millennium Era, Godzilla has always been weird. Anyways, this giant plant mutant not only has one of the most intimidating designs of any Godzilla monster, I mean, just look at her. She's literally towering over Goji and looks like Audrey 2 mixed with an alligator. But also, I think they make for a really interesting fighter. They mostly fight with super long vines, so they'd kind of be like a mid-range zoner. They wouldn't be able to reach all the way across the screen. However, the moment that you start to get close to them, you would have to make your way through waves of rose thorns if you want to get up close to her. Then, if you do manage to get in her face, she could just breathe toxic pollen on you, stunning you, then smacking you away again. However, her big weakness, other than having a massive hurt box, is that most zoners also have a method to get away from the opponent, but Biollante, sure, she can move, but she's not that mobile. Heck, she'd be like the one character in this game who can't jump. So if you do somehow manage to get in on her, she'd be in trouble. Although maybe we could give her some kind of move where she can transform into a cloud of pollen and then teleport to another location on the stage. Yes, that is a thing that happens in the movie. She does have the power to turn to a big cloud of pollen, and speaking as somebody with seasonal allergies, that makes her the most evil monster of all time. Rodan. Mothra can't be our only airborne monster, and luckily there's another super famous contender right over here. Yeah, Rodan is another classic kaiju who has crossed over with Godzilla about a dozen times, appearing in almost every single era of his films, sometimes as a villain and sometimes as one of Godzilla's closest allies. Heck, he even once sacrificed himself to bring Goji back to life. Rodan's connection to Godzilla runs deep, so if you're making a brand new game, they need to be in there. Now, Mothra was going to be a zoner, and while Rodan does have some projectiles, their number one feature is their speed. Rodan isn't just incredibly fast, they also use that speed in battle. Yeah, you'll often hear a lot of people talk about these kaijus saying, oh, this monster flew from one planet to Earth in this amount of time, so that means that they're this fast. Yes, they are fast, but the moment they actually get into battle, they still just stand there and punch and kick like normal. Rodan actually zips around at high speeds as they fight, meaning that in this game, they are definitely going to be our big rushdown character. And maybe we could even give them some kind of a special fire meter, and as they take damage, it slowly builds up. And when it's full, they'll enter Fire Rodan mode, giving each of their attacks a burning effect that will do additional damage over time. We're talking about kaijus here, at least a few of them are going to need some kind of a power-up form, and Fire Rodan is iconic.
Today, Seatopia goes to war. Come on, rise up now to the Earth's surface. Destroy the Earth! Destroy our enemies! Rise up! Megalon!
Megalon. Alright, we've got a lot of big famous faces in here so far. We need to fit in here a few more of the out there choices. Those ones who, they're known, but they aren't exactly staples. And Megalon has only been in one official full-length film. However, I'd still say there's something of a favorite among Godzilla fans. Maybe it's their unique design, maybe it's the iconic and very poorly aged movie poster, but something about them just stuck with audiences. And Toho has continued to promote this guy for generations, putting out tons of toys, making sure they're in all the games. Heck, just 2 years ago, they put out a brand new Godzilla vs. Megalon short. So yeah, despite his slim resume, this is still a pretty big face for this franchise. And I'm picturing that Megalon would be kind of a Rekka fighter. In that short film that I mentioned, they made sure to take full advantage of his spiked arms. using them to stab the opponent and even turning them into a drill. And I mean a I will pierce the heavens style drill. It was kind of a big deal. So I picture Megalon having plenty of moves that involve multiple stab attacks that continue with each input you add onto it, or charging forward with a big drill attack that keeps going as long as you continue to mash on buttons. King Caesar. Alright, in case Megalon wasn't a deep enough cut, how's King Caesar sound to you? Well, okay, I know I'm making it sound like he's a complete unknown, but honestly, I always kind of liked King Caesar. I always thought his design was pretty cool. In a world full of big scaly dinosaurs, having a kaiju based on a guardian lion statue is kind of awesome. Now with that being said, yeah, that design is like 9% of the reason why I'm including him in this roster. He's only been in one film, and he wasn't even the main villain of that movie. He got overshadowed by Godzilla. And yes, I know he was also in Final Wars, but everyone was in Final Wars. That doesn't mean anything. But darn it, I like him. So if we can put him in this game and make him stand out, try to make him cool, then I am going to take that opportunity. That being said, yeah, we're probably going to have to invent a lot for this character because they have almost nothing to pull from. They have an energy attack, but I dare you to find a single kaiju on this list who doesn't have an energy attack. That doesn't make you special. And then he's got a pretty mean shoulder tackle. And then after that, I start drawing a blank. So you know what? Screw it. Let's get creative. King Caesar was an ancient guardian who had to be awakened by a statue and a song. So let's give Caesar a little statue figure right above his super meter. Then give him a move where he does a quick stance and you'll hear a bit of his song play. And that statue will then glow a different color. Depending on what color it glows, he'll get enhanced strength, speed, or defense. Again, I am aware that this is not a power that he has in the movies, but he did have a statue and a song awaken him from his slumber. This is a way of showing him awakening brand new powers using a statue and a song. Listen, sometimes when you put these rosters together, you gotta get creative with the tools that you have. And oh hey, speaking of how King Caesar got overshadowed by Godzilla,
Godzilla が2頭。こう早く本物のゴジラが現れるとはな。
Godzilla. Yeah, this is one of Godzilla's longest running enemies and easily one of the most iconic. But just like Godzilla himself, we now have to ask, what version of Godzilla are we going to use? Every single generation of Godzilla has had their own version of Godzilla. Showa, Heisei, Millennium, Monsterverse, even that Netflix anime trilogy had their own version of Godzilla. And don't get me wrong, most of Godzilla's big villains and allies also appear in these different eras. But most of them tend to be pretty similar. Godzilla, on the other hand, is very different, not just in terms of powers and how he would fight, but also in terms of their origin. Is Godzilla an evil weapon sent here by aliens trying to take over the world? Or are they a mech that's here to protect Japan and being driven by a pilot who has something to prove? Well, I'm going to go with Kiryu, the Godzilla from the Millennium era. Partly because I just think they have the sickest design, but also, Kiryu and their pilot Akane just have the best story in my opinion out of all the other Godzillas. I think a lot of fans really enjoy Akane and her character arc, so if we were going to give this game a story mode, or heck, even just endings to their arcade modes, Akane and Kiryu would definitely be the best choice to go with. As for how they'd play, well, Godzilla is meant to be a robotic counter to Godzilla, so they'd have a little bit of an overlap. They would definitely have some all-rounder tendencies, but they lean a little bit more into zoning. Kiryu had a solid selection of missiles and a jetpack to create some distance, so while they could get up close and personal, they'd also be happy to keep their distance. And for the big super, it has to be the absolute Zero Blast, freezing the opponent in place so Kiryu could just unload their whole moveset on them.
Jet Jaga, Jet Jaga, Yatta de Jaga.
Jet Jaguar. As long as we're covering one big robot, I should probably tackle the other one as well. You want to talk fan favorite characters? Jet Jaguar is way up there. They've had very few actual appearances in the movies, and by that I mean only one. Yeah, I had to double check that because I swore they were in more than just that. But they have been in tons of video games and comics because people just like this robotic superhero that much. Maybe it's his design, maybe it's his theme song, maybe it's that a generation grew up seeing him in that Mystery Science Theater 3000 episode. Who can say? All I know is he's got fans who would want him in this game. Problem is, yeah, just like with a lot of the characters I recently mentioned, he doesn't have a whole lot to pull from. Again, he's only got one movie, and most of his moves in those video games were created entirely for those games. But you know what? That's okay. I mentioned with King Caesar, sometimes you gotta get creative. Sometimes you have to make up brand new moves for a character so that way they can have a complete full moveset. So there's nothing wrong with giving Jet Jaguar some brand new tools just for this game. But as for their actual playstyle itself, honestly, I'm going basic on this one. I say we make him another all-rounder. Heck, make him the Shoto of this game. I just said the reason that Jet Jaguar keeps getting included in these games is because he's a fan favorite. Well, who better to make super accessible and a very beginner-friendly character than the one that fans are probably going to want to play as?
Rise!
Gigon. We're a little over halfway through this roster, and I'm already starting to run out of ways to say iconic, but yeah, Gigon is another monster who is very iconic to the Godzilla franchise, and he's considered by many to be one of his biggest enemies. He's had multiple different interpretations over the years, but in each of them, he is always the ultimate weapon of an invading alien race, and he's always considered to be one of the most brutal and deadly kaijus. In the Godzilla vs. Mothra book, Gigon was described as being bloodthirsty, ferocious, and cutthroat. So of course, he is going to be one of the most aggressive characters in the game. He's going to be up there with the MonsterVerse Godzilla as one of the two big F it we ball monsters in this roster. When he starts attacking, it is just going to be a barrage of claw slashes and buzzsaws. Heck, you could even give him an install super where he transforms into his modified form from Final Wars, and now for a limited amount of time, he's got chainsaw arms that do extra hits on all of his attacks. I joked earlier that King Ghidorah would be the Sagat of kaijus. Gigon would be the Akuma. This guy puts no points into defense because he never stops attacking. The Scar King. Okay, I have no idea how Godzilla fans are going to react to this inclusion because yes, he was created for the MonsterVerse films, and unlike the MonsterVerse Godzilla and Kong, Scar King only exists in these films. He's their own original character. So I'm sure some fans will say he doesn't fit with the other monsters, but as I said, any monster from any Godzilla film counts for this roster, so he's in. But no matter what argument somebody might make about this inclusion, I am going to override it. Scar King needs to be in the next Godzilla fighting game because, to put it simply, this is a fighting game. And Scar King would fight completely different from any other monster on this list because he's the only one that uses a weapon. Yes, Scar King carries around a massive whip. All these other contestants are fighting like big monsters. Scar King is fighting like he's in Soul Calibur. His whip would give him some solid mid-range normal attacks, and he could even use it to pick up chunks of the stage and throw it at the opponent. And I don't mean he would just pick up a random rock and throw it. No. Let's say whatever object he throws changes depending on which stage you're on. You're fighting on a Paris stage, he picks up a tiny part of the Eiffel Tower and throws it at you. You're fighting in the Antarctic, he picks up a giant iceberg and tosses it your way. Little stuff like that can give these characters that extra bit of flavor that can be so important to making them memorable. And of course, he has to have some specials where he calls on his Arctic Titan Shimo to come out and freeze the opponent. Or for their big level 3 super, you could have Shimo come out and start continuously freezing the stage, and now for a limited amount of time, your opponents will move slower and take extra damage, making them sitting ducks for your barrage of whip slashes. Again, I have no idea how die-hard Godzilla fans are going to feel about this inclusion, but I know fighting game fans are going to be happy with it. Monster X. I said Scar King would be in here because he would fight more like a traditional fighting game character. Well, that goes double for Monster X. This guy feels like a kaiju that was designed specifically for a fighting game.
In fact, he kinda looks like a character you'd see in a kaiju-themed fighting game.
See what he said. Monster X is in this roster not just because they were the big threat of Final Wars, a pretty famous film in the Goji library, but also because, just like Scar King, he would fight more like a traditional fighting game character. You look at this kaiju and it doesn't feel like a guy in a big rubber suit, it feels like a guy who knows martial arts in a big rubber suit. So to put it simply, Monster X would be our combo fiend in the game. Not a lot of damage, but kicks and punches that just chain together easily to create some really nutty possibilities that go on for days. And some of you might be wondering about their transformation. Yep, at the end of the film, Monster X takes on their true form, Kaiser Ghidorah. I'll admit, I was tempted to make Kaiser Ghidorah a separate fighter, but nah, if this is Monster X's final form, have that be their big super. Make it like Nemesis Super in the Versus games, where they grab you and then they go into a cinematic of them turning into Kaiser Ghidorah and unleashing a huge attack. Titanosaurus. Okay, we need one more surprise character in this roster. Normally I say all fighting games need that weird pick, that character who nobody would expect to be in here, but well, honestly, in a franchise like Godzilla, once you go over 10 characters, there really is no such thing as a weird pick. Just those picks you probably wouldn't expect. But that's still important. Choices like that keep the roster from feeling predictable. And sure, we got some picks in here like King Caesar who might have been unexpected, but I think we can go further, get even more out there. So I'm going to go with Titanosaurus. They're a sea serpent, so you could give them some water-based attacks, but my main reason for putting them in this game is because so far this roster could be divided into big guys in suits or really out there doesn't look humanoid at all characters. Titanosaurus is kind of right in the middle, giving us an interesting potential moveset. They stand upright, they've got arms and legs, but they're shaped like a serpent. They've got a long, stretched out body. So let's make them not just an agile character, but a very uniquely agile character. Let them be able to essentially swim around the stage, making them very hard to follow. They can grab opponents and curl around them with their long, snake-like body. Let them extend their tail for some really good range on their attacks. I will admit, once again, I am making up a lot of this stuff for the game itself. In the movie, he kind of basically just punches, kicks, and has one wind-based attack with his tail, which... No! We have Mothra in here for the wind-based attacks. You're a sea serpent. You're going to use water and move like a snake. My point is, they wouldn't be incredibly strong, but they would be a character that opponents would have a hard time figuring out. Alright, that was our last out there choice. We've only got 2 more slots, so so it's time to go out with a few more big names. Space Godzilla. Let's see, we got Heisei Godzilla, Monsterverse Godzilla, Mecha Godzilla, and now Space Godzilla. I think I've lost the rights to call Dragon Ball FighterZ Oops All Goku ever again. And as for why I'm including this variation, listen, I could go on a whole spiel about why they're important and why they're popular, but it's Godzilla, but from space. You know exactly why he's popular. Well, okay. He's not Godzilla from space, he was actually a clone that was created when Godzilla's cells merged with a black hole. You know, story old as time. And despite looking so similar to Earth Godzilla, Space Godzilla has a totally different moveset. Sure, they have their own unique energy blast that would be different from Goji's atomic breath, but the majority of Space Godzilla's movesets come from their crystals. Yeah, those giant shoulder pads aren't just for show. They can make walls of crystallized energy to reflect attacks, create crystal pillars across the ground, and they can also create floating crystals that they send at the opponent. To me, this sounds like the perfect recipe for a setup character. Let's say that he can set up traps on the ground, and when an opponent travels over it, a crystal will fire up at them, or he can create floating crystals and then they will fire at the opponent on their own after a limited amount of time, making him one of those characters that gives opponents multiple things that they have to focus on all at once. Destroya. And now for that one person in the chat who has been asking this entire time, was he seriously going to forget Destroya? Nope, I just saved the biggest for last. I mentioned that Ghidorah was Godzilla's biggest rival, but if there is one kaiju who feels like Godzilla's endgame, it's Destroya. Because to put it simply, Destroya is the kaiju who killed Godzilla. Well, kind of. You see, the Godzilla from the Heisei era isn't the Godzilla from the original film, but that original film does exist in the continuity of the Heisei era, meaning that Godzilla showed up, was destroyed in that movie, and then this Heisei Godzilla is a completely separate Godzilla. What the heck does that have to do with anything? Well, the original Godzilla was killed by a device called the Oxygen Destroyer. But when the Oxygen Destroyer was used, it ended up mutating a species of crustaceans, turning them into the giant satanic-looking Destroya. So Destroya's origin tied directly into the death of the first Godzilla, and in the film Godzilla vs. Destroya, the Heisei Godzilla also died. Yeah, this monster is how the Heisei era went out. So it feels like if you were building this roster for an actual game, this is definitely the final monster you would want to reveal. In fact, I was tempted to make them the boss of the game, but let's be real, people would want to play as Destroya. I gotta make sure that they're in the starting roster. And to put it bluntly, Destroya would fight like a big in-game threat. He would be incredibly strong, we could give him a command grab that lets him fly across the stage at the opponent, and he'd be one of the biggest kaijus in the game, so even his normal attacks would have pretty good range. However, his big downside would be his speed. His attacks would be strong, but they wouldn't be that fast, letting quicker characters find plenty of openings to punish him. However, to help with that, you could give Destroya a special where he summons in one of his smaller insectoid forms to run across the stage, helping to keep the opponent from rushing them down. Heck, for one of his supers, you could make it so he could just summon in a whole swarm of his little bug versions that keep filling up the screen for a limited amount of time, making it so that for several seconds, your opponents are just completely helpless as Destroya gets in their face and starts attacking. And I mentioned that I was tempted to make Destroya the big final boss of the game, so we should probably talk about who is the actual boss. And that's going to be Godzilla Ultima. Now, full disclosure, I originally had a different monster in here, who we will be talking about shortly, and I was going to leave Ultima out of the game completely because I said that we were counting the movies, and Ultima is from the Singular Point anime. But some of our patrons did make some strong arguments for Ultima's inclusion, and, well, what can I say? They won me over. Well, okay. Them and the Godzilla vs. Hulk death battle that dropped while I was editing this video. Yeah, that was some weird timing. Yeah, I'll fully admit, I was not the biggest fan of the Singular Point anime, but watching that death battle, it made me realize, oh, okay, I kind of get it now. This is actually kind of cool. For anyone who doesn't know, Godzilla Ultima is essentially Eldritch Horror Godzilla. It's a doomsday weapon created by a god who can alter reality to essentially make Godzilla unstoppable. And it's even implied that all the different Godzillas and all the different kaijus throughout the entire multiverse in every continuity all stem from this dark otherworldly source. So not only does that sound like the most evil version of Godzilla imaginable, and a Godzilla who would explain why all these different kaijus from all these different continuities are all coming together for this game, making them the perfect contender for the big final boss who they all have to fight, but also, I repeat, they have an eldritch god altering reality to make them unstoppable. If there is one version of Godzilla who would be impossible to turn into a playable character, it's the one who has so much plot armor they're literally unstoppable. Meaning the boss role is kind of the only place they would fit. And there is your starting roster for a brand new Godzilla fighting game. Anguirus, Biollante, Destroyer, Gigan, Godzilla Heisei era, Godzilla Monsterverse, Jet Jaguar, King Caesar, King Ghidorah, King Kong, Mechagodzilla Kiryu, Megalon, Monster X, Mothra, Rodan, Scar King, Space Godzilla, and Titanosaurus. Gotta say, pretty happy with this starting roster. Got a good spread of all the favorites, the classics, and a few more out there picks. Granted, this roster was a little bit easier than most of the rosters that we do on this show. Godzilla films recycle enough characters that it's not that hard to come up with a decent roster for their games. But that doesn't mean that there aren't plenty more monsters that we could include. Which is a good thing because we kinda have to do the DLC as well. That's sort of what we do on this show. Alright, these days most fighting games get about 4 characters per season, and I could see this game getting 3 seasons. I mean, there were 3 Pipeworks games, makes sense to me. And considering how many more versions of Godzilla there are out there, I'm going to say that each season should have one new version of the Big G-Man. And for season 1, we're kicking it off with the original, the Showa-era Godzilla. How would this Godzilla fight to make him different from the others? Simple. The other Godzillas would fight like giant animals. Showa would fight like a guy in a suit. Yeah, watch those old Showa movies and you'll see classic Godzilla had hands. This guy would pummel opponents with his fist, and he'd even be a partial grappler. Again, check out those older movies. Showa Goji loved to pick opponents up and slam them into the ground like he was a wrestler. And of course, his big super attack would be him leaning back on his tail and then sliding across the stage at the opponent for a double leg drop. There was no way we weren't working that into his moveset. But that's not the only Showa version of a character that we're including. Imagine the trailer for Season 1 of the DLC starts with classic Goji stomping around, beating up some of the other monsters, then he turns and he looks up as Showa Mechagodzilla comes flying down. Yeah, like I said, Mechagodzilla had a ton of variety between the different eras, not just in terms of powers, but also in terms of motivations. The Millennium Kiryu version of Mechagodzilla was a hero protecting Japan. The Showa Mechagodzilla was a villain sent to Earth by an invading alien race. Imagine the pre-fight dialogue exchange between the pilots of these two mechs. That alone makes me want this in the game. Plus their moveset would be different. Kiryu was a semi-zoner, but Showa Mechagodzilla? Yeah, there's no semi about it. That is the most zoner to ever zone. They would fill the whole screen with laser blasts and even have a shield to keep opponents from getting in on them. Their big downside though would be that Mechagodzilla, not that mobile. That's a character that loved to just stand there menacingly. So if you could get past all of their attacks and then break that shield of theirs, they would be left wide open. Then I'm going to include Batra. Yeah, why should Godzilla be the only monster who gets dark versions of themselves? Batra is honestly one of my most requested monsters for a brand new film because I love their design. If you had told me they were going to make an evil version of Mothra, I'll admit I would have laughed at you. But nobody was laughing when Batra showed up. And of course they'd be another flying character, but unlike Mothra who was a zoner, Batra is way more aggressive, so they would be all about getting up close in the opponent's face. Just throwing out their really aggressive attacks with their wings, their horns, their claws, just stuff that makes the opponent afraid to fight back. And for the final character of Season 1, you need somebody that will surprise audiences and get them talking. So I'm including Bagon. Now, if you're a fan of the Godzilla movies, you might be asking, who? And there's a reason for that. Bagon has never been in a Godzilla film, but he's almost been in like 5 of them. Yeah, this guy was proposed for half a dozen movies and they all got canceled. For generations now, a Bagon movie has been the Charlie Brown football for Godzilla fans. And eventually the video game world just got tired of waiting for it and said, screw it, he's gotta appear in something. So they put him in Super Godzilla as the big final end boss. So if you want to include that deep cut, that character that will make Godzilla fans stand up and pay attention, you go with Bagon. And as for how he'd play, honestly, you can do whatever you want with him. Again, he's never been in anything but a Super Nintendo game. We can totally just look at our roster and ask, what are we missing? And then work that into his moveset. Heck, maybe we could get really meta with it and just make him a stance fighter who just shifts between all the different versions that have been pitched for him over the years. And that brings us to Season 2. First up, Hedorah. Earlier I mentioned including weird out there picks, and I just know somebody said, what about Hedorah? Don't get me wrong, Hedorah is weird, but they're also oddly popular, so I don't really feel they count as a good out there choice. Granted, they might only be popular because they're so weird, so it is an interesting conundrum, but Hedorah is essentially just a big slushy pile of goo. The movie was very environmentally focused, so Hedorah feels like one part Godzilla villain, one part Captain Planet villain. They're essentially just walking pollution. So because of that, in this game, Hedorah is going to be a status effect character. They could put poison all over the stage that would lower the opponent's life, they could put piles of muck on the ground that would slow opponents down when they move over it, give them some noxious gas that would stun the opponent for a limited amount of time. Listen, you take one look at this guy, and you know he's the type of monster who is going to put like 5 different status effects on your character, and they're all going to be incredibly annoying to deal with. Then I'm throwing in Orga. Honestly, I was nervous to include Orga because, well, not only do they only have one movie under their belt, but they're only in like the last couple minutes of it. Out of all the characters in here, they might have the least that I can pull from. However, the movie they came from was the film that launched the Millennium Era of Godzilla. Feels like they're important enough to include. And as for how they'd fight, this is going to sound crazy, but I think Orga should be our puppet fighter. In the film, Orga telepathically commands their spaceship to fight Godzilla. Granted, they really only get like one shot off before it's destroyed, but screw it, we don't have a puppet fighter in here yet, so that's good enough for me. I can totally see Orga fighting on the ground, but having moves that command the spaceship to fly across the stage or start firing at the opponent to cover them, giving Orga plenty of time to get in their face for some one-on-one combat. And next up is easily the most controversial pick in this entire roster. That's right, the Godzilla from the 1998 American film will not be in this game. No, trust me, I know that Godzilla fans share some love for pretty much any kaiju, but even they haven't warmed up to this guy yet. This version of Godzilla is still too hated to this day. Plus, we don't need them in here. We know how that version of Godzilla would fare in a fighting game. Yeah, not well. However, that is not who I am including. No, I'm including their kid, Zilla Jr. Yeah, after the failure of the American Godzilla film, an animated series was launched that showed one of the babies from that film surviving, growing up, and then teaming up with a team of humans to travel across the world and fight other kaijus. And you know something? That cartoon actually wasn't bad. And as much as classic Godzilla fans hated this movie, they tend to be pretty positive on the show. So here's my pitch. Season 2 of this game launches. We get Hedorah and Orga. We have a whole cinematic of the two of them fighting, but then that cinematic slowly turns into the animated cartoon style of the Godzilla series, and the camera pulls back, and we see a bunch of humans in the heat base sitting around watching this fight, and they say we need to get Zilla to go in there and break him up. Then you start playing the old theme song from that cartoon, you get that animated Zilla going in there and fighting Orga and Hedorah. You would hit so many nostalgia buttons for a very specific audience with that trailer. Heck, in the game itself, we could even give Zilla Jr. their own unique cel-shaded look unlike any other character in the game to really drive home the fact, no, this is not the movie, this is the cartoon. And Zilla Jr.'s design is definitely based on speed, so they would be another Rushdown-focused character. But I know some people are thinking, you said there would be a Godzilla every single season, please tell me that's not our Godzilla. Nope, as I said, Zilla Jr. is not Godzilla, they're their own separate thing. So our official Godzilla for this season is going to be Shin Godzilla. This was originally going to be our boss for the game, but just because they got bumped for another apocalyptic Godzilla doesn't mean I'm not going to shove Shin in here somewhere. Listen, Shin Godzilla might be my favorite Godzilla film ever, I had to fit them into this roster. And the big thing about this version of Goji was that they kept evolving. No matter what was thrown at them, they would transform into a bigger, stronger version of themselves. So I say when the match starts, Shin Godzilla has several moves that are just locked off to them. But once they pull off a certain requirement, they can unlock some of those moves, essentially letting them evolve and become stronger as the fight goes on. Basically making them like the Susanoo of this game. Not sure how many Godzilla fans know their BlazBlue lore, but if you got that reference, you're welcome. And that brings us to the final season, and I'm going to start things right off the bat with our final version of Godzilla, the Millennium Godzilla. We got Showa represented, Heisei, Monsterverse, and even a rep for the Roa period. We need a fighter who can be the face of the Millennium era Godzillas, or else it just feels unfair. And as I said earlier, yes, the Millennium films don't really have a solid continuity. Each Godzilla in those films are kind of their own thing, so I'm going to have to pick one film specifically, and I'm going to go with the Final Wars version of Godzilla. I'm picking this version because when you think about the other Godzillas in here so far, we got the All-Rounder, the Rushdown, the Grappler, and the Super Technical Fighter. But the Final Wars Godzilla is going to be our tank. Not only is he larger than most of the other versions of Godzilla, but in Final Wars, Godzilla travels across the world, taking on every kaiju from his rogues gallery, one after another, non-stop. If there is any version of Godzilla who I can see being the heavy hitter of the game, it's this one. He'd be slower and less combo focused than the other Godzillas, but he would have attacks that could just plow through the opponent's offense and just obliterate their life points. Then I'm going to throw in here one final old school entry and one more out there choice. I'm going with Baragon. I always like Baragon. For some reason they always remind me of a dog. That's it, sometimes you don't need a bigger reason to like something. But I'm throwing them in here because I think they could have a really interesting playstyle. Baragon can dig and tunnel under the ground, which raises several questions when you consider how big he is. But since this is a kaiju fighting game, meaning it would be an arena fighter, or at least a 3D fighter, taking advantage of the big city-destroying aspects of kaijus, that means we would need at least a few characters in here who can use that big open arena to their advantage, really playing around with the whole landscape. So let's say that Baragon has the ability to drill under the ground and then quickly travel around. Not forever, only for short bursts, but it would make them really hard to catch. And let's say they have the ability to leave dirt traps on the ground, and if an opponent walks over them, then they'll fall into it and get stuck. Admittedly, we would have to think of something different to do with flying characters, but you know what? We can figure that out. Make it so those dirt traps turn to dirt geysers that just spray up at the flying opponent if they go over it. Trust me, we can totally figure something out. This is a fighting game about giant kaijus. Physics are whatever we say they are. Now for our penultimate character, a lot of Godzilla fighting games have created original brand new monsters for their games, so you know what? We're going to do that as well. That's right, a brand new kaiju that has never been in any other Godzilla property. And you might be asking, wow, Thorgy, are you really just going to drop your own monster OC into this game? No, I am not. I am going to drop Stan Winston's own monster OC into this game. Say hello to the Griffin. Yeah, if you think Bagon was a deep cut, you haven't seen anything yet. We all know the 1998 American Godzilla film. We've already talked about, don't need to discuss it any further. But you might not have known that movie came after the canceled plans of a 1996 American Godzilla film. And Godzilla was going to be designed in that film by special effects wizard Stan Winston. This guy is a legend in Hollywood. He is the go-to monster maker, and he was going to design a brand new Godzilla, as well as a totally brand new villain for him. And he didn't just come up with an idea for it, no, he made full-blown models for it, calling it the Griffin, and this thing looks sick. This is one of my favorite kaiju designs, and it's for a kaiju who has never existed in anything. Somebody please do something with this design. Put it in a movie, turn into a Dungeons and Dragons monster, put on Magic the Gathering card, I don't care, this thing just needs to live on in something. Well, I say if Bagon was able to find life in a game after all those movies got canceled, then we can do the same thing for the Griffin. And that brings us to our final monster, and there are still so many left that we could choose from, but we need to go out big. We need to go out with something that feels impossible and will get people talking. And nothing would do that quite like... That's right, our final character is a guest character, it's Gamera. I know you might be thinking, but Thorgy, you said no guest characters. You said if we let Gamera in, then you would have to open the door for all the other guest characters. Yes, that was the rule. The longtime fans of this show know what I always say, the base roster establishes the rules, the DLC breaks those rules. And yes, if you lay in one guest character, it now means that you have to consider all guest characters. They're all on the table. But guess what? This is our final character, meaning I don't have to worry about anyone else. So yeah, get Gamera in here as a guest character, close the whole game out with him, and everyone would go nuts for it. How would they fight? Does it even matter? We got Gamera in a Godzilla fighting game, that's all you need. But for those of you who are curious, well, they're turtles, so they would have high defense, it goes with the territory. But Gamera also has some pretty good mobility, they fly around like a UFO. So let's combine those two together and give them high defense, but make them a character who just throws themselves across the screen. Let them do 8-way dashes and let them zip across the screen at crazy angles. Heck, give them a launcher attack that just sends the opponent upwards, and then Gamera zips up after them and keeps hammering the opponent with their shell, juggling them in the air and keeping them from coming back down. In a world of arena fighting kaijus, let Gamera fight like a Marvel character. That was a sentence I didn't think was ever going to come out of my mouth when I started this show, but I stand by it. And there you have it, a full 18 character roster, 3 seasons of DLC, and hopefully 0 copyright claims from Toho. Toho? I'm giving you free advertisement here. Be cool, Toho! But I hope everyone enjoyed our video here today. I hope I made all you Godzilla fans happy. And as I mentioned at the start, if you know nothing about Godzilla, but this video got you interested, it is surprising how many places you can find films legally and for free. Tubi, the Internet Archives, it is really easy to get into Godzilla. But if you already are a Godzilla fan, let me know what you thought of today's roster. What do you have included? Who is that one super obvious choice that I totally forgot? Seriously, I know there is somebody crazy obvious who I am forgetting and it is driving me nuts. But let me know that and more in the comments down below, or you can find me on Blue Sky at Thorgy's Arcade. Also, I wasn't kidding in that intro. If you haven't subscribed yet, we are really close to 100K, and I want to hit that number by the end of the year. So hit that subscribe button, ring that bell, and if you could, please share these videos around the web. It really does help us out. Also, huge thank you to all of our patrons for their support, and if you want to get extra stuff from us, like behind the scenes footage or exclusive videos, you can follow the link in the description down below like all these fine people here. For example, some of our patrons last month got a video of me putting this roster together, so they got to watch my brain melt in real time. And honestly, I hate saying man, okay. Here's the thing. Here's the freaking thing. It should be Millennium Godzilla going off. I'm gonna say that right now. Millennium Godzilla should be kicked off of here because that's too many Godzillas. Oh, that was a fun afternoon. Anyway, thank you guys very much for tuning in. Stay safe out there and come back next time. Oh, by the way, for the one person out there wondering, I ended up saying Godzilla in this video 197 times.